Auzubillahiminash-shaytanir-rajim. Bismillahir-rahmanir-rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our new session on Lady Lazarus, the poem by Sylvia Plath. Today we will look at some of the critical aspects of this poem. Dear students, this poem, Lady Lazarus or Lazarus by Sylvia Plath, like many other poems of this poetess, which are called the protest or agitative poems, should be analyzed from a psychological point of view as an outpour of a neurotic energy through the channel of creative art or poetry. It is, in a sense, a kind of therapy, therefore. Then, dear students, it is necessary to understand the anger as being directed against the channel forces of inhumanity, violence, and destruction, only symbolized by the males in this very poem. By a process of association and surrealism, the protest, the anguish, the anger, the agitation moves from common males to Hitler, the particular, his experimenting doctors, the scavengers of gold on dead Jews, the dentists who had turned before the corpses were disposed of for leather, soap, nightshades, and fertilizer. The individual is associatively linked to inhumanity and oppression. Sylvia Plath herself said that her personal experience is very important, but I believe poetry should be relevant to larger things as well, such as Hiroshima and Dachau and so on. This means that the frustration and anger against a dominating father, or anyone for that matter, becomes a starting point or central symbol for larger issues including Hitler, torture, inhumanity, violence, Holocaust, war crimes, and many more certain larger issues of the age. The poem is therefore also about the victimization of modern warfare. The persona is not only real people, they are types. The poem is less autobiographical than it is universal. In fact, the theme of universal female protest, agitation in the modern world is the most striking theme in this poem. The female speaker represents the creative force, and she is angry with the destructive forces symbolized by males all around her. Dear students, the allusions and references to the Second World War are all real. Sylvia Plath had witnessed the havocs of the Second World War while she was in England. The anger against the German soldiers, Hitler and his Nazi party is not too much, or is not out of place rather. The reader will justify this anger if he tries to imagine the inhumanity and cruelty of Hitler against humanity. As we go through the poem, we come across that the intention of the speaker is to die. Just yielding to death will not annihilate her, yet she completes the poem with a final comeback, the assertion that she makes. The poem is technically a bitter dramatic monologue indeed. The title ironically identifies a female Lazarus, whereas the original Lazarus was male, whom Christ brought back to life by the grace of God. The present speaker is identifying herself with the Lazarus, different in sex, behavior, attitude, environment, and everything. Plath's persona in this very poem is a figure who wants to subvert all that she can of the tradition that attempts to bring you back and torture rather than let you choose yourself, death, and die. This female figure also represents the oppressed modern women, conscious of the fact that the male society will bring her back to life because it needs to satisfy itself by oppressing the woman. The poem destroys the myth. It borrows it to reject and state an antithesis. Dear students, in this case, the poem's persona does not conform to society's traditional idea of ladylike behavior. She is angry and she wants to take revenge in every way. She owes only to herself, not to Jesus. Self-destruction pervades the poem as it did Plath's life itself. As confession mutates to myth, subjectivity inclines to generalized feeling in the poem. Having taken up the battle with the enemy on his terms, she concluded by warning the male deity and demon that when she rises from the ashes, she will consume men as fire does. She will return from death like the Sphinx and eat men like vampires or fire. It is psychologically and symbolically about the aspiration to revenge that is felt by all the female victims of the male domination. Once they become conscious of the domination and get some power over men to take revenge. Powerful enough to take revenge. And the revenge would be against the institutions that dominate women. The poem is about a woman's wish to turn the tables on her father and his kind. Its dramatic overstatement of male evil may sound intolerable to some readers, but it must be taken to poetically express the resentment in the female mind that was suppressed for ages against all kinds of injustice inflicted upon them by male society and traditions, rather than by individual male upon individual female. And this anger will be justified if one thinks of the extremity of long-borne suffering of women through the ages. The myth of Lazarus is transformed in this poem into the myth of the re-incarnating phoenix, the bird which immolates itself every 500 years, but rises whole and rejuvenated from its ashes. Dear students, besides, the bird has become a being that reincarnates, not just to remain immortal, but to take revenge on its adversaries. Sylvia Plath provided a self-explication during a radio reading. The speaker is a woman who has the great and terrible gift of being reborn. The only trouble is she has to die first. She is the phoenix, the libertarian spirit. What you will do against it? Dear students, the poem is presented in shape of 28 stanzas, which is also very symbolic, associated with the productivity and creativity and recreativity of women, rebirth after a certain period of time. Here, the wish to die for freedom on the part of the poetess is very significant. To be reborn and to be able to reproduce, to be productive again as a queen. The poem is said to evolve from many kinds of losses and tragedies that Sylvia Plath experienced and wanted to turn into positive advantages. As you know very well, as readers of Plath, that her life had been a complete mess indeed. Her childhood was frustrating. Her marriage to the new lover, Ted Hughes, was a complete failure. Her divorce just shattered. Her relationship with her parents were also very dubious, mysterious. All her life was full of frustrations, disadvantages, and she wanted to turn these disadvantages, the depressions of her life, failures of her life, into something positive. This poem can be called an attempt to interpret her suicidal attempt as a process to transform herself, whether she succeeded in it or not, or failed herself. Plath experienced many losses from her very early age to the mature age. She probably wanted to convert these losses into achievements as a source of illumination and energy to fight against the adverse forces working against her in order to survive in this very world that was suffocating to her. Dear students, Lady Lazarus, as we go through its text, itself defines the central aesthetic principles of Plath's later poetry. The poetry she wrote right near about her death. First, the poem derives its dominant effects from the colloquial language, the language of common people. From the conversational opening, I have done it again, to the clipped warnings of the ending, beware, beware. Just a very dramatic way to impress upon the readers. Lady Lazarus appears as the monologue of a woman, speaking spontaneously out of her pain and agony and psychic disintegration, the frustrated soul, the painful cry of a frustrated soul. Then the poetess has used and introduced the Latinate terms like annihilate, filaments, opus, valuable are introduced as sudden contrasts to the essentially simple language of the speaker. The obsessive repetition of the keywords and phrases gives enormous power to the plain style used throughout the poem. As she speaks, Lady Lazarus seems to gather up her energies for an assault on her enemies, and the staccato repetitions of phrases build up the intensity of feelings, just like a train goes on to speed up its speed for reaching a destination. The gradual speed up, that is. This is the language poured out of some burning inner fire. Though it retains the rhythmic precision that we expect from a much less intensity felt expression, it is also a language made up almost entirely of monosyllables. Plath has managed to adapt a heightened conversational stance and a colloquial idiom to the dramatic monologue form. Lady Lazarus is a poem commonly understood to be about suicide. It is narrated by a woman and mostly addressed to an unspecified person. But we feel that generalized audience is the audience of men in general. The narrator, the speaker of the poem, begins the poem by saying she has done it again. Every 10 years she manages to commit this unnamed act. In the early stanza, in the first stanza, opening stanza of the poem, she considers herself a walking miracle with bright skin, her right foot a paperweight and her face as fine and featureless as a Jew linen. She addresses an unspecified enemy, asking him to peel the napkin from her face and inquiring whether he is terrified by the features he sees there. She assures him that her sore breath will vanish in a day or two. She is certain that her flesh will soon be restored and resurrected to her face after having been sacrificed to the grave, and that she will then be a smiling 30-year-old woman again, rejuvenized, regenerated, reborn, She will ultimately be able to die 9 times, like a cat, and has just completed her third death. She will die once each decade. After each death, a peanut crunching crowd shows in to see her body unwrapped. She addresses the crowd directly, showing them she remains skin and bone, unchanged from who she was before. The first death occurred when she was 10, accidentally. The second death was intentional. She did not mean to return from it at all. Instead, she was as shut as a seashell until she was called back by people who then picked the worms off her corpse. She does not specifically identify how either death occurred in the past. Now, as an expert in this act of dying, she believes that dying is an art like everything else, and she does it very well. Each time it feels real and is easy for her. What is difficult is the dramatic comeback, the return to the same place and body, occurring as it does in broad daylight before a crowd's cry of a miracle, miracle. She believes people should pay to view her scars, hear her heart, or receive a word, touch, blood, hair, or clothes from her. In the final stanzas, she addresses the listener as her doctor, her enemy, sneering that she is his crowning achievement, a pure gold baby. She does not underestimate his concern, but is bothered by how he picks through her ashes. She insists there is nothing there but soap, a wedding ring, and a gold filling. She warns her God, her Lucifer, to beware of her because she is going to rise out of the ashes and eat man like air. Dear students, Lady Lazarus is a complicated, dark, and brutal poem, originally published in the collection named Ariel. Plath composed the poem during her most productive and fecund creative period. It is considered one of Plath's best poems and has been subject to a plethora of literary criticism since its publication. It is commonly interpreted as an expression of Plath's suicidal attempts and impulses. Its tone veers between menacing and scathing, and it has drawn attention for its use of Holocaust imagery, similar to Daddy, the famous poem. The title is an allusion to the biblical character Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. The poem is about multiple suicide attempts. The details can certainly be understood in this framework. When the speaker says she has done it again, she means she has attempted suicide for the third time, after one accidental attempt and one deliberate attempt in the past. Each attempt occurred in a different decade, and she is now 30 years old. Now that she has been pulled back to life from his most recent attempt, her sore breath will vanish in a day, and her flesh will return to her bones. However, this recovery is presented as a failure, whereas the suicide attempts are presented as accomplishments. Dying is an art that she performs exceptionally well. She seems to believe she will reach a perfection through escaping her body. By describing dying as an art, she includes a spectator to both her deaths and resurrections. Because the death is a performance, it necessarily requires others to witness this performance. In a large part, she kills herself to punish them for driving her to this condition. The eager peanut crunching crowd is invited but criticized for its voyeuristic, morbid type of impulse. The crowd could certainly be understood to include the reader himself. since he reads the poem to explore her dark impulses. She assumes that her voyeurs are significantly invested. They would pay the large charge to see her scars and hurt feelings. However, she imbues this impulse with the harsh criticism by comparing the crowd to the complacent Germans who stood aside while the Jews were thrown into concentration camps. Further, the crowd ultimately proves less an encouragement than a burden when they also attend the resurrection ceremony. Thus, she despises the second part of the process and resents the presence of others at that time. Whether this creates a vicious circle in which that resentment is partially responsible for the subsequent attempt is implied but not explicitly stated. Critic Robert Bugg explores the speaker's contradictory feelings towards the crowd by writing that Plath is not bound by any metaphysical belief in the self's limitations. Instead of resisting the self's antagonists, she derives a tremendous thrill from throwing her imagination into the act of self-obliteration. She can destroy her body, but her imaginative self remains a performer, always aware of the effect she has on others. Dear students, the poem can also be understood through a feminist viewpoint as a demonstration of the female artist's struggle for autonomy, freedom in a patriarchal society, man-dominated society. Linda K. Boudzen writes that the female creation of a male artist god is asserting independent creative powers. From this perspective, from a feminist point of view, that is, Lady Lazarus is not merely a confessional poem detailing depressive feelings of a person, but it is rather a statement on how the powerful male figure usurps Plath's creative powers but is defeated by her rebirth and resurrection, all powerfulness in the end. Though Lady Lazarus knows that the victim, Lady Lazarus, knows that her doctor will claim possession of her body, soul, and her remains after forcing her suicide, forcing her to die. But she equally believes that she will rise and eat men like air. She is confident to come back and to take revenge. Her creative powers can be stifled momentarily by this possessiveness of the male domination, but she will always return stronger, rejuvenized, regenerated, reborn, re-strengthened indeed. Very sorry, dear students. The poem can also be understood in another way, in a larger context rather, as a commentary on the relationship between the poet and the audience. In a society that, as Pamela Anas, a critic, claims, has separated creativity and consumption, the crowd views Lady Lazarus, the poetess, Plath, as an object only, and therefore doesn't recognize her as a human being. Plath reflects this through her multiple references to body parts, separated from the whole of her self as a human being. Dear students, viewed from this point of view, this interpretation of the poem, Lady Lazarus' suicide then becomes an assertion of wholeness, an act of self-definition, self-determination, and the last desperate act of contempt towards the peanut-crunching crowd. The only way she can keep herself intact is to destroy herself, and she does this rather than be turned into commodities. Though her doctor will peruse her remains, study her remains, observe her remains for commodities of the world like gold filling or etc. She will not have been defeated because of her final act, final act of self-assertion. As has often been the case in Plath's poems, the Holocaust imagery has drawn much attention from critics and readers alike. It is quite profuse in this poem. Lady Lazarus addresses a man as her doctor, her enemy, her god, and her Lucifer. She describes her face as a Nazi lampshade and as a Jew linen. One effect of these allusions is to implicate the reader, make him or her implicit in passive voyeurism by comparing him or her to the Germans who ignored the Holocaust, the inhuman killing, the violence against humanity at large. However, the Germans also served to establish the horrific atmosphere, then be understood as patriarchy, as a society of consumers, or as simply cruel human beings. It is a sophisticated exploration of the responsibilities we have for each other's happiness or unhappiness, rather than simply a dire, desperate, depressive suicide note. Then, my dear students, dying is an art like everything else, points to the fact that annihilation is the basic theme of the poem. Lady Lazarus, as the poem's title implies, is a poem about resurrection, but implicit within its title and Sylvia Plath reference to the man whom Jesus brought back to life from the dead is the idea of annihilation or extinction, a theme that is never far away from us with the Plath poem. Lady Lazarus, as a poem, was written by Sylvia Plath in October 1962, only a few months before her final suicide attempt, and the poem is shot through with references to her previous suicide attempts. Plath would kill herself in February 1963 in a London apartment she had decided to rent because W.B. Yeats, the famous poet, Irish poet, had once lived there in that apartment. As she suggests in Lady Lazarus, Plath had attempted suicide previously at roughly 10 years intervals. Sigmund Freud, in his 1920 book Beyond the Player Principle, had described Thanatos, or the death drive, what Philip Larkin called desire of oblivion, as a compulsion to repeat and repeat and repeat. And this is how Lady Lazarus begins, with the reference to having done something again and again and again. The something or it being suicide here, or attempted suicide. For Plath, her suicide attempts represent a sort of death, and her survival is more of a coming back from the dead than a mere continuation of living as a human being. The death imagery in the poem and references to suicide are darkened, brutish, further by allusions to the Holocaust. Death not on an individual scale, but mass genocide against the Jewish population. Remember, Plath herself was a part Jewish. The Nazi lampshade and references to her doctor, her enemy, her god, and her Lucifer all evoke the recent atrocities of the Holocaust and place Plath's own longing for extinction uneasily within the context of the mass murder of those who were actually killed, and not by their own hands, but by the atrocities of Hitler and his soldiers. But doctor here also doubles up as a reference to Plath's doctors and psychiatrists who treated her both when she attempted suicide and when she underwent electroconvulsive therapy for her depression. You know very well she was a neurotic and she was continuously treated by the doctors. Another aspect of Lady Lazarus, which is alluded to in Plath's reference to the peanut crunching crowd, is the idea of suffering as a spectacle, a theater of cruelty to which people might pay to see. What the novelist J.W. Ballard, less than a decade later, would call the atrocity exhibition, you may say. This is the theatrical performance of suffering, indeed. Again, and hiding within these references is the uneasy knowledge, that disturbing knowledge that Plath may secretly like the idea of making a spectacle of her suffering, her agony. Dying is an art, as she famously puts it in this very poem, something she does exceptionally well. Plath's use of Lazarus as a figure for her own near-death experiences may have come from T.S. Eliot, whose 1915 poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, features a reference to the biblical figure who came back from the dead. And coming back is key. The second time she attempted to end her life, Plath tells us she meant to last it out and not come back at all. Dear students, Eliot's Prufrock, another figure who appears to long for escape and wishes he could have been born a pair of ragged claws, skirting along the seabed rather than a shy, balding man in 20th century America. And it is worth mentioning here in passing that Plath, like Prufrock, is a product of early 20th century Boston. Had imagined what it would be like to come back from the dead. To say, I am Lazarus, come back, come from the dead, come back to tell you all. Plath has died and come back and is not telling us all, perhaps half in the knowledge that next time she may not come back at all. Ideas of death and resurrection, of, in a way, surviving or conquering death, which is a theme that characterizes Ted Hughes' poetry too, such as his examination at the womb door from his later sequence Crow, abound in Lady Lazarus, when Plath's speaker announces, like the cat I have 9 times to die. She acknowledges the old folk belief that cats have 9 lives, a proverb that implies the idea of cheating death time and again, an idea that is, of course, fallacious, for cats are just as mortal as any other creature in the world. Interestingly enough, and perhaps chief among all of these images of resurrection and rebirth, is the idea of the phoenix. Lady Lazarus ends with an allusion to this mythical bird which rose from its own funeral pyre. Like another late poem, Alm, Lady Lazarus is about rebirth, but it is a dark and despairing take on this idea of rebirth. Dear students, obviously, Sylvia Plath is one of the most influential in modern feminist discourses. Poem like Lady Lazarus is often celebrated as iconic for Plath advocated feminism. Unlike other modern feminist frontiers' sincere approach to patriarchy, Plath's feminism evolves from her protagonists' deep-rooted hatred for their male counterparts. Indeed, this hysterical hatred and antagonism of Plath's narrator in the poem, Lady Lazarus, seems to put the sincerity and responsibility of Plath's feminist authority into question. A female self-like man eater Lazarus is, in the first place, self-destructive and certainly not desirable at all. Yet the confessional mode and the techniques of a female's self-conjuration ultimately signify Plath's modernist trends in modern feminist discourse to portray a woman's self-perception of her position in a male-dominated society. Obvi- Obviously, the narrator in the poem, Lady Lazarus, need not be misunderstood as the representative of Plath advocated feminism. Indeed, Lady Lazarus is to be deemed as Plath's effort to voice the modern woman's nascent self through self-confession. And thus we may say that Plath's Lady Lazarus is to be considered as a woman's effort to voice herself in modern society. The narrator in the poem voices herself through a sort of self-confession. In the poem, the confession authority appears to be in a dual mode. The reincarnated lady speaks out her mind before the oppressive authorities, A. the Nazi doctors, and B. the gathering of multitude around her. Obviously, Plath's readers are provoked to align themselves with the gathering multitude in the poem. The confessing self-portrayal of Lady Lazarus as a martyr of patriarchy, if not frighten the gathering crowd by letting them take a glimpse at the furious and revengeful heart of an oppressed lady, certainly arouse the pity and fear at the lady's situation. Meanwhile, Lazarus's modern female self begins to exist, shredding its non-existence of ages, shedding away its non-existence of ages. Indeed, both Plath's poem's confessional mode and its narrator's hysterical self-revelation ironically endow the non-existent feminine self with existence. It gives voice to a woman's silence of ages. For Foucault, confession is essentially a feature of modern man, which is meant for producing the truth about the confessor's self. As he says, the truthful confession was inscribed at the heart of the procedures of individualization by power and has become one of the West's most highly valued techniques for producing truth. As you people know very well, as students of literature, that confession is also one of the main features of the religious confession that is made in churches by the Christians. Dear students, coming on to conclude our discussion on different aspects of this poem's interpretations and critical views, we may say that Plath's narrator's common antagonism against men as a community of oppressors compels a reader, though misguidedly, to think of the peculiarity of their behavior and attitude towards men. Such frenzied, peculiar violence of one of Plath's narrator is evident in the following lines from the poem Lady Lazarus. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. Margaret Dickey, a famous critic of Plath, comments on this peculiarity of the poem in the following lines. Plath's late poems are full of speakers whose rigid identities and violent methods not only parody their torment but also permit them to control it. The peculiar nature of the speaker in Lady Lazarus defies ordinary notions of the suicide. Indeed, it is as peculiar as that of frenzied women who have been deprived of thinking rationally of man, and essentially she tends to be characterized as an antagonist against man, not against patriarchy, indeed. Thank you very much, dear students, for participating in today's discussion. This is the end of our critical view of this poem. Thank you very much again. See you soon, inshallah, in our next meeting. Till then, it is Allah Hafiz and goodbye.